They called him a beast. Caged in the cold, sold for $50 to anyone stupid enough to take him. But that day, in a quiet mountain town, a retired officer with nothing left to rescue looked once into the dog's eyes and couldn't walk away. This isn't a story about heroism. It's about two broken things that chose to stay. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this quiet story can travel. Because maybe, just maybe, someone out there is still waiting to be chosen. The cold came early that year, in the mountain town of Trinidad, Colorado. The kind of cold that doesn't knock but slips in quietly, under jackets, into bones, beneath memory. The trees had already given up their leaves, leaving bare branches scratching at the sky like forgotten prayers. The wind pushed through the narrow streets like an old friend who never learned to whisper. It was the last Sunday of the month, and with it came the final market of the season. A ramshackle affair behind the grain silo on East Main. The kind of market where people sold hand-knit scarves, rusted tools, chipped teacups, and memories that no longer fit in their homes. Most came for the kettle corn or the cinnamon sugar fry bread. Some came for company, even if they pretended not to. Silas Monroe parked his weather-worn pickup beside a row of beat-up trailers and stepped out slowly, knees stiff from old injuries and colder mornings. His gait, slightly uneven, had followed him since the fire in 12. He didn't mind it much now. Like most things, it had softened with time. He wasn't there to linger, just needed a replacement string of lights for the porch, something his late wife would have picked, something that blinked soft and warm against the evening dark. He kept his head down, one hand in the pocket of his flannel-lined coat, the other gripping a folded list that had only one item on it. The market wound like a half-forgotten memory, folding tables sagging under antiques and flannel blankets, children chasing each other with sticky fingers, the smell of wood smoke and weak coffee clinging to the air. A banjo player near the corn truck sang old Hank Williams, and nobody listened, but nobody asked him to stop either. Then came the sound. Not a bark, sharper than that. It was a snarl, sudden and violent, like a warning from the end of something that had already broken too many times. Silas stopped. Off to the edge of the lot, between a dented horse trailer and a rusted fence line, stood a cage. Iron bars welded crudely together, black with old weather and spots of blood-brown rust. Inside crouched a German shepherd, heavy-boned but gaunt, fur streaked with dirt and patches of gray. One ear folded in half, the other flicked back with each motion of the crowd. The dog didn't bark. It watched. Low to the ground, tense, tracking every movement like it was a threat. People didn't stop, not really. They passed with chuckles, whispers. "That's the one I told you about. Things touched in the head. Ought to be put down." A teenager tossed a bottle cap toward the cage. It bounced, sharp, and the dog flinched, but didn't retreat. It only growled low, guttural, like it had nothing left but sound. Silas stood still. Next to the cage, a man in a puffy camo vest and oil-stained jeans leaned against a folding chair, chewing something from a red can. He caught Silas looking. $50 and he's yours," the man said, voice slick with disinterest. "Might rip your throat out, might just die on your porch. Either way, not my problem no more." Silas didn't answer. He stepped a little closer. Not much, just enough to see more clearly. The dog's eyes weren't wild the way people said. They weren't feral. They were tired, like it had been watching the world end slowly, and no one had asked how it felt about it. He remembered those eyes. Not exactly, but the kind. In the rearview mirror of a fire truck when a woman lost her husband. In the dark hallway outside a hospital room. In his own reflection, the night after they took Clara home for hospice. He didn't need a dog. His house was quiet in the way he'd taught himself to accept. He liked his routines, the way the floor creaked near the sink, the way the radio only played static before the music caught hold. He didn't need anything else. But still, he didn't walk away. The man selling the dog spat to the side, shaking his head. Crazy mutt's good for nothing but scaring off raccoons. Ain't no pet. He'll rip your arm off soon as lick it. Silas didn't flinch. He stepped a little closer to the cage. The German Shepherd didn't lunge, didn't snarl. It tilted its head, ever so slightly. That was all. Just enough to say, I see you too. Silas reached into his wallet and pulled out 2 folded 20s and a crumpled 10. It was the money he'd saved for the porch lights, plus a few bills he didn't know were still there. He set it down quietly on the edge of the seller's table. You said 50. The man laughed once, sharp and ugly. You serious? Silas didn't answer. The cage creaked as he knelt beside it. The ground was cold. He didn't reach for the latch, just sat there for a long moment, coat brushing against the dirt, eyes on the dog. And for the first time, the dog didn't growl. It exhaled. Not a sound of relief, not yet. But something quieter. Something like surrender. Or maybe it was just the wind passing through the bones of both man and beast, long after everyone else had stopped noticing they were still there. The crowd moved on. The banjo player struck a wrong note, and nobody cared. Silas stood up, brushed the dust from his knee, and looked at the man behind the table. I'll take him now. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. Some things don't come with reasons. Some things come with eyes that ask you not to walk away. The ride back to Silas's house was long, but not far. Trinidad wasn't a big town, just wide in the way old towns settle into the land. Hills leaning against its edges, fences half fallen, storefronts with faded signs and handwritten hours. His truck groaned slightly as it climbed the slow curve leading out of town, the kind of sound that matched the season. Tired, but still moving. In the crate secured in the truck bed, the German Shepherd lay silent. No barking, no howling. Just the heavy rhythm of breath that fogged the plastic corner of the crate each time he exhaled. Silas checked the rearview mirror, not often, but just enough to catch those eyes. Dull, but watching. Not feral, still not. Just waiting. The heater inside the cab barely kept the cold at bay. Silas didn't mind. He wore his old canvas jacket, the one Clara always said made him look like an out-of-work rancher. The lining was torn near the wrist, thread dangling like forgotten thoughts. On the radio, a grainy country station played a track from 1974. Silas recognized it within 3 notes. The song had played the day he and Clara drove up through Canyon City for no reason other than the sky was clear. He hadn't heard it in years. He hummed the melody quietly, just under his breath. Not for the dog. Not really for himself either. It was more of a remembering than a song. In the mirror, the shepherd's ear twitched. Silas kept driving. The road curved west along the edge of the Purgatoire River, where the cottonwoods stood bare and sentinel-like, and the water moved slow, like it too was in no rush to get anywhere anymore. There were no other cars, just the wind brushing against the truck bed, and the occasional whistle of air slipping past the crate's vents. The dog shifted once. No growl, just the thud of a body repositioning over cold metal. Silas caught a glimpse in the rear view. The dog had laid its head down, not curled up, but flat against the floor, legs stretched forward as if anchoring itself to something invisible. The house wasn't much. It sat on the southern edge of town, near the base of the hills, where pine gave way to low grass and old mining roads. A one-story place, clapboard siding grayed by time, a porch that creaked if you stepped wrong, and a swing that no longer swung. It hadn't changed since Clara died, not in any real way. He kept the porch swept, the gutters clear. But he hadn't painted it in 5 years, didn't see the need. He parked beside the gate and killed the engine. The silence was immediate, but not empty. The kind that carried weight, the kind that expected something. Silas stepped out, joints protesting, and made his way around the back. The crate door creaked open. The shepherd didn't bolt. He didn't move at all. Silas waited. Eventually the dog stood, slow and deliberate. One of the rear legs dragged slightly. A limp, not sharp, but long-lived. Old injury, poorly healed. The shepherd looked up, eyes meeting Silas's for just a moment before lowering again. Not submission, not challenge, just acknowledgement. "You'll do," Silas muttered softly, not sure who he was talking to. The two walked, not side by side, but not far apart, across the dry patch of yard. The grass had long gone brittle. There was a small pine tree in the corner, one Clara had planted their second Christmas in this house. It never grew right. Too much shade. But it stayed green longer than the lawn ever did. Silas opened the screen door, holding it wide. The dog paused at the threshold, eyes flicked across the porch. The wind stirred the old chimes Clara had hung near the window. They clinked against each other in tired conversation. The shepherd's ear twitched again. Then, slowly, he stepped inside. The living room was dim. No overhead lights, just the soft yellow from a table lamp near the worn recliner. A woven rug covered part of the floor. Bookshelves leaned under the weight of war novels and National Geographic back issues. On the far wall, above the fireplace, a framed photo of Clara in her garden. Knees in the dirt, hands in gloves, face sunlit and smiling in a way only Silas ever got to see. Near the hearth, Silas had laid out an old braided rug, one that used to sit beneath their Christmas tree. He'd dusted it off earlier that morning when something in his gut told him he wouldn't come home alone. He didn't point to it, didn't pat it, just let it be there. The shepherd stood at the center of the room, taking it all in, not sniffing, not pacing, just standing, as if trying to understand the rules of a new world. Then, with a carefulness that seemed unnatural for something his size, he stepped onto the rug and lay down. Not curled, not alert, just down. Silas watched for a moment, then moved to the kitchen. He opened a can of something bland, scooped it into a metal bowl, and filled another with water. He placed both a few feet from the rug. The dog didn't move. Back in his chair, Silas sat slowly, his body settling into grooves carved over years of the same weight. He reached for the folded newspaper on the table, flipped it open, tried to read, but his eyes drifted to the rug, to the dog. The shepherd was breathing slow, steady, but his eyes were open. That night, neither man nor dog spoke. No barking, no commands, no names, only the crackle of dry pine logs, the faint hum of an old refrigerator, and the sound of two things long broken, beginning to rest in the same quiet. The house had grown quieter with each passing year, though it never complained. It simply adapted, wood settling deeper into the foundation, floorboards groaning more slowly with age, hinges sighing instead of squealing. Silas had stopped noticing those sounds long ago, or maybe he'd grown into them. They matched the rhythm of his own life now, slow, practical, unrevised. Clara's touch still lingered in the spaces she once filled, the careful way the pantry jars were labeled, the faded lavender towels still folded in the guest bathroom, the small basket of books beside the reading chair. He hadn't changed much since she passed. Maybe he couldn't. Or maybe he didn't want to find out what changed might feel like. Thorin hadn't moved from the rug since the night before. He hadn't touched the food or the water, but he hadn't growled either. His body rested low, weight pressed into the floor like he didn't quite trust it to hold him. The fire had long gone out, replaced now by the pale light of early morning spilling in strips across the floor through blinds Clara had sewn herself. Outside, the wind still carried winter's breath, brushing the dry grass flat and whispering against the window panes. Silas stood in the kitchen in wool socks and an undershirt, a chipped mug of black coffee in one hand, his other braced lightly on the counter. He watched Thorin from across the room. The dog's ears were angled toward him, but his eyes remained closed, body unmoved. Silas didn't speak. Words, he'd learned, didn't build trust. Time did. Presence did. The slow, ordinary consistency of being there, without needing anything in return. After breakfast, Silas stepped out onto the porch. The wood was cold beneath his feet. A squirrel darted across the yard, pausing briefly at the base of the pine tree before disappearing under the shed. The wind tugged at the edge of the tarp covering Clara's old rocking bench. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, not Thorin, not yet. When he came back inside, the shepherd had lifted his head, just barely, eyes tracking Silas as he crossed the room, as if checking that the man still belonged in this space. Silas gave a quiet nod, not toward the dog, but more to the moment itself, as if to say, still here, still us. He opened the back door to let the air move through the house. Cold, yes, but honest. The kind of cold that aired out ghosts. Above the doorframe hung a small wind chime, hand-forged iron pieces that Clara had found at a roadside sale up near Walsenburg. It didn't ring like the dainty porch chimes most people hung. It made a deeper tone, low and deliberate, the sound of an old bell in a distant chapel. When the breeze caught it, it sang, just once, then fell silent again. Thorin turned his head toward it. Silas noticed. Later, after chores were done, he stood in the doorway holding the paper but didn't sit. Instead, he watched the dog for a moment longer, the rise and fall of ribs too visible beneath that weather-beaten fur, the scars near the left haunch, the paw that still curled slightly when he shifted. Silas had seen pain like that before, not the kind that bled, but the kind that stayed. In old firefighters who couldn't sleep through sirens, in young officers who laughed too loudly after funerals, in himself, in the mirror, on quiet evenings with nothing to distract the memory. He did something then that surprised even him. He began to read the paper aloud, not loudly, not with any kind of performance, just the classifieds, then the weather. His voice was low, even, the kind of voice one used with a stubborn engine or a skittish horse. Thorin didn't move at first. Then, slowly, One ear shifted toward the sound. He didn't lift his head, but he was listening. Silas didn't comment, just kept reading, as if to himself. The room didn't change, but it felt different. Less hollow. More attended to. That night, when the fire was lit again, and the soup had long since gone cold on the stovetop, Silas sat in the same chair, not reading, not speaking, just resting. The dog still hadn't eaten, but he hadn't retreated either. He lay with his body turned slightly toward the hearth, and though his eyes remained half-lidded, Silas noticed something had shifted. The stiffness was less sharp, the breathing less guarded. When the wind howled again, brushing snow against the side of the house, Thorin lifted his head and gave a quiet sound, not a growl, not a bark, something in between, something raw, and then, just as quietly, he lowered it again. Silas didn't move, didn't speak. But he set the empty coffee mug on the table with care, leaned back, and let the silence settle. Two figures, one man, one beast, both scarred in places time couldn't erase, sat in the warm hush of a house that remembered how to hold grief. Nothing changed visibly that night. No dramatic breakthrough, no tail wagging, no paw offered. But in the space between firelight and breath, something old began to soften. Not yet trust, but the absence of fear. And sometimes, that's all the beginning needs. The mornings came slow in Trinidad, Colorado. The kind of mornings where the sun didn't rise so much as quietly appear, filtered through frost and old windows. Silas stood by the sink, his back turned to the room, the kettle beginning to hiss on the stove behind him. Outside, the pine branches bent slightly with the weight of yesterday's snow, and the sky held that pale, indifferent gray that never promised much, the kind of sky that matched old bones and old hearts. Behind him, Thorin lay on the rug near the hearth. He hadn't moved much over the past 2 days, not beyond adjusting his position or shifting his weight with effort. He still hadn't touched the food. He still hadn't barked. But he was there. Always there. Watching, but not asking. Listening, but not reacting. It wasn't silence born of peace, but one forged through surviving too long in a world where noise brought pain. As the kettle whistled, Silas reached for a mug, same one he'd used every morning for the past 5 years. It had a chip near the rim and a faded print of a trout leaping from a lake. Clara had bought it during their first camping trip in Gunnison. He poured the hot water over a bag of strong tea, stirring once with the spoon, slow and mechanical. He didn't speak, just moved, quietly, deliberately. He knew what it was like to live in a body that flinched at sudden things. By the back door, the wind chimes stirred again. The deep bell-like tones rolled once through the kitchen. Thorin's ears shifted. It wasn't the first time. Silas had noticed the day before, how the dog's body stiffened slightly whenever that chime sang. Not in fear, not in panic, just awareness, like it was connected to something he remembered, something long ago. The chime wasn't gentle. It didn't tinkle like wind through fine china. It sounded like old iron moving through air, solemn, weighted. Clara had loved that sound. She said it reminded her of the church bells from her grandmother's house outside Taos. Silas stepped to the door and pushed it open, just enough to let the cold draft in. The wind caught the chime again. Thorin didn't lift his head, but his body changed. Shoulders tight, ears tall, breath slightly hitched. The dog's eyes didn't shift from the fireplace, but Silas could feel the way he was listening. Not to the house, but to the sound. That afternoon, Silas did something strange. He sat in the living room and read the newspaper out loud again. Not to fill the room, but to mark the time. His voice was steady, measured, not meant to impress or entertain. He read about local council elections, an accident on the highway, an ad for someone selling hand-carved walking sticks. Thorin lay still, but he didn't turn away. Silas didn't look for reaction. He just kept reading, turning the page slowly, like it mattered that he said the words out loud. Maybe it did. Later, he walked out to the small shed by the back fence. He pulled the old stepladder forward and retrieved a cardboard box from the highest shelf. Inside were holiday lights, some tangled, some broken, and a few things Clara had packed away herself: winter scarves, a set of windsocks, and a worn brown blanket. Silas pulled the blanket free, shook it gently, and brought it inside. He didn't place it on Thorin, didn't try to drape or cover him. He simply laid it near the edge of the rug, folded once, close enough to be chosen. Then he returned to his chair and picked up the book he hadn't touched in months. A few minutes passed, then a few more, and then, with the kind of movement that was almost imperceptible, Thorin shifted. He stretched out his paw, just one, and rested it against the edge of the blanket, not pulling it, not claiming it, just touching. The fire crackled once. Outside, the snow began again, light and hesitant. Inside, the two figures shared a room not through conversation, but through nearness. That night, when Silas turned off the lamp and let the fire die down, he paused near the hearth and looked at the dog. Thorin's eyes were closed, body still, but the paw remained on the blanket, and near the edge of the food bowl, a single kibble was missing. Not enough to mean change, but enough to mean notice. As he climbed into bed, Silas heard the wind push against the window, and the chime above the door gave one long, deep sound. In the dark, he listened, not for footsteps or barking, but for breathing, and it was there, soft, even. Not all progress comes in leaps. Some of it comes in a quiet room, a warm rug, and the weight of one paw resting gently on a memory. It was a Wednesday morning when Silas finally made the drive down to the small grocery store off Nevada Avenue. Not out of need, his pantry still held more than enough canned soup, oatmeal, and instant coffee, but because routine had a way of asking something from him, and he didn't see a reason to argue. The truck took its time waking in the cold, the engine coughing twice before catching. He let it idle longer than necessary, glancing once toward the front window before backing out of the gravel drive. Thorin sat behind the glass, barely visible through the frost-lined pane. He didn't move, didn't bark, but he watched. And that was something. A week ago, Silas wouldn't have believed even that was possible. The store was half full, mostly older folks, retirees with lists in shaky hands and long memories folded into every corner of every aisle. They nodded at Silas the way small-town people do, like he'd been there yesterday and every day before that. A few said his name, some still called him Officer Monroe out of habit, and he responded with the same polite nod, the same soft, "Mornin'," voice low but never dismissive. He picked up a loaf of bread, a small carton of eggs, and a battered box of dog biscuits that looked like they'd been on the shelf since last summer. Clara had once said he shopped like someone preparing for a storm that might never come. Maybe she was right. Maybe the storm had already come and just decided to stay. He was checking the expiration date on a jar of peanut butter when he heard the voice. "Monroe, that you, or is the ghost of Christmas past wearing flannel today?" It was a familiar voice, gravel smooth, laced with too many cigarettes and too many opinions. Silas turned and saw Dennis Pritchard standing near the freezer section, leaning slightly on a cart with one bad wheel. He wore a Denver Broncos jacket that had outlived at least 3 quarterbacks, and a smirk that hadn't aged gracefully. Silas didn't smile. He never did around Dennis. But he nodded. "Dennis, you still working part-time with the highway patrol, or just collecting that pension and watching deer cross the road?" "Bit of both," Silas said. Dennis squinted. "Heard a funny thing last week. Someone said you picked up a dog. Not just any dog, a mean one. Big shepherd. Came from the flea market. You know the one. Guy was trying to offload it for $50 and a beer." Silas turned his attention back to the jar, twisting the lid lightly in his hands. "I heard something like that too." Dennis chuckled. "You training him to sniff out regrets, or just looking for someone who listens better than people?" Silas didn't answer. He didn't need to. Dennis leaned a little closer. "You know that dog's got a rep, right? Bit a kid 2 towns over. Least that's what folks say. Should have been put down. Should have stayed in that cage." Silas met his eyes. Not hard, not angry. Just steady. "People say a lot of things." There was a pause then, just long enough for the hum of the freezers to fill the space. Dennis shook his head and muttered something under his breath, then pushed his cart away. The bad wheel squeaked with every turn. At checkout, the girl at the counter, a quiet teenager named Rosie who barely spoke to anyone, scanned his items without looking up. But when she reached the box of dog biscuits, she hesitated, then glanced at him. "Is it true?" she asked softly. "About the dog?" Silas paused, then nodded once. "Yeah." Rosie blinked, then smiled. Not wide, just the kind of smile that flickers and vanishes before it fully lands. "I hope he likes these." "He will," Silas said. "Eventually." Back at home, the sky had started to clear. Patches of blue cracked through the gray, and the sun touched the snow just enough to make it shine without melting it. Silas parked the truck, grabbed the bag, and walked toward the porch. Before he reached the steps, the door creaked slightly, just a shift from the wind. And there, in the window, stood Thorin. The dog was still. But his posture had changed. He wasn't crouched. He wasn't tucked into the far corner. He stood, not tall, not proud, but upright, watching. When Silas opened the door, Thorin didn't retreat. His tail didn't wag, but he didn't flinch either. Silas carried the bag to the kitchen, moving with the same slow rhythm as always. He placed the dog biscuits on the counter, then filled the water bowl again, even though it was still half full. He poured a fresh scoop of food and set it beside the rug. Thorin stayed back, near the window, watching. Then something small happened. As Silas turned to take off his jacket, Thorin stepped forward, 2 careful steps, his body low, cautious but deliberate. When he reached the edge of the rug, he stopped. And then, with a motion that held more meaning than words ever could, he lowered his head, not to the food, not to the floor, but toward Silas, not in fear, not in submission, but in something quieter, something older. Like recognition. Like, "Thank you." Silas didn't speak. He just stood there, his hand still resting on the sleeve of his coat, the light from the window brushing the room in gold. He gave a quiet nod, then turned back to the counter and let the silence hold them both. Outside, the pine tree leaned gently in the breeze. The wind chime moved once, deep and slow. And inside, for the first time, the man and the dog stood close enough to begin something that didn't need to be named. The snow came at dusk. Not a soft dusting, but a steady, hushed fall that buried sound and turned everything into a watercolor of whites and grays. It came down in sheets, thick and determined, swallowing fences, branches, tire tracks. By the time Silas drew the curtains and stoked the fire, the world outside had vanished. Just pale silence beyond the windows, broken only by the occasional creak of wood settling under the weight of cold. The radio had cut out an hour earlier. Some local station gone dead again from the ridge near Weston. Silas hadn't tried to fix it. He just let it sit. The knob turned to static, the familiar hum oddly comforting. Clara used to call it ghost music. She said silence had its own kind of voice if you sat with it long enough. Silas didn't argue with her then, and he didn't now. Thorin lay near the hearth, not curled but stretched, his legs tucked close, head resting on the edge of the rug. He hadn't moved much since morning, but something in his posture had softened. His ears stayed alert, twitching occasionally at the wind, but his breathing had steadied. The house had begun to accept him, or maybe it was the other way around. Silas sat in his usual chair, the one with the worn arms and a loose spring that groaned when he leaned too far back. He had a blanket across his knees and a book in his hands, though he wasn't really reading. His eyes flicked to the fire, then to the dog, then back again. He let the pages turn slowly, more out of habit than purpose. Then the power flickered. The overhead lights blinked once, twice, then went dark. The refrigerator gave one last sigh before falling silent. The fire crackled louder in the absence of anything else. Silas didn't move. He'd been through worse. Storms like this came every winter, fierce and unapologetic. They knocked things out of balance and then disappeared as quietly as they came. Still, he rose and walked to the kitchen, lighting a candle from the drawer, its orange glow stretching long shadows across the walls. Behind him, he heard it. Not barking, not a growl, a howl. Low and cracked, like a song long forgotten. It wasn't full-throated or wild. It was almost unsure of itself, like a voice that hadn't been used in too long and didn't remember how to speak. Silas froze. The howl came again, not loud, but deep, pulling from a place far beneath the ribs. Thorin stood now, just behind the firelight, head lifted slightly, not looking at Silas, not looking at anything at all. His eyes were half closed, ears pinned back. Silas moved slowly, returning to the living room. He said nothing, only sank to the floor, not near the dog, but not far. The candle flickered between them, and the snow pressed harder against the windows. Thorin stopped howling, but his body trembled. Not from cold, from something older. Fear that didn't make noise. Memory that didn't ask permission. Silas reached toward the firewood, added 2 small logs, and sat back, his legs crossed beneath him. He didn't try to call the dog. He didn't use a name. He just spoke softly, his voice worn but steady. I don't like the dark either. His hand rested palm up on the floor beside him. Not an invitation, just presence. Thorin stared at the fire, body taut. but he didn't bolt. He didn't bare his teeth. The wind outside picked up, and the iron chime above the back door groaned once, its tone heavy like the bell of a far-off church. The dog turned toward the sound, just his head, and then slowly, carefully, he stepped forward. Not all the way, just enough for his front paws to land on the edge of the rug where Silas sat. He stood there, breathing hard, nostrils flaring, and then he sat. It was clumsy, unbalanced, like he hadn't done it in a long while. His back legs stuck slightly, hips stiff, but he settled, weight low, and lowered his head toward Silas's open palm. Not fully, not trust, not yet, just close. Silas didn't move his hand. He didn't try to touch, but he let his fingers curl just slightly, and in that small motion, something passed between them, something unspoken. Outside, the storm battered on. Branches creaked, snow piled against the porch. The house held firm. Inside, the room stayed still, two figures carved out by firelight and memory. The candle burned down slowly, wax slipping into the base. Thorin blinked once, then closed his eyes. Silas didn't sleep that night. Not because of the cold, not because of the storm, but because, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone in the quiet. And the sound of another breath beside him felt like proof that maybe, just maybe, the worst had passed. Not all the way, but enough. The snow began to melt 3 days later. Not all at once, not enough to make puddles, but enough that the edges of things began to reappear. The tops of fence posts, the gravel beneath the truck tires, the brittle stalks of Clara's garden pushing back into daylight. The storm had passed, but it left behind a silence that felt heavier than the snow itself. The kind of hush that settles after something has shifted, but before you fully realize what. Silas stood on the back porch with a thermos of coffee, watching steam curl into the late morning air. The sky was soft and dull, like worn linen stretched thin. Across the yard, Thorin moved carefully through patches of thawed ground, nose to the wind, tail low but not tucked. His gait was uneven, the old injury in his back leg more noticeable when the cold lingered. But he walked. That was something. Every few steps the dog would pause, glance back, then continue, never more than a dozen yards away. Silas didn't call him. He hadn't used the dog's name out loud yet, not since that first night. Some things, he figured, needed to be earned by quiet understanding, not claimed by sound. From across the fence came a voice, small, worried. "Mr. Monroe?" Silas turned. A boy stood near the edge of the property, half hunched, arms wrapped tight around himself. Maybe 9 years old. Small for his age. Brown winter jacket unzipped halfway. Cheeks flushed from wind and effort. His name was Sam Riggs. Lived 2 doors down with his grandfather, a retired mechanic with shaking hands and a bad temper. Silas stepped forward. "Sam, you all right?" The boy nodded, but his eyes said otherwise. He looked over his shoulder toward the woods behind the houses, a tangle of oaks and spruce that thickened quickly once the path disappeared. "I was out with Eli," he said, voice thin. "My dog. He chased a deer into the trees. I tried to follow, but I can't find him. I yelled and yelled, but he won't come back." Silas glanced toward the tree line. The snow hadn't fully melted back there. The woods would still be wet, cold, uneven, not safe for a boy that size to be wandering through alone. "How long's he been gone?" I don't know. A while. Thorin had stopped walking. He stood now at the corner of the yard, ears up, eyes locked on the boy, nose twitching at the air. Silas grabbed his coat from the hook inside and pulled it on. Let's take a look. I didn't mean to get him lost, Sam whispered. I know, Silas said simply. The two of them moved slowly through the tall grass and down the small slope where the trees began. The ground was soft and uneven, littered with sticks and melting ice. Silas scanned the tree line, eyes sharp despite the age in them. He could still read the land like a map, every scuff of paw print, every break in the brush. Years of tracking and fire rescue and patrol hadn't faded. Behind them, a quiet shuffle. Thorin followed, head low, moving without command. They called the dog's name, both voices fading against the cold. The trees swallowed sound in the way winter always did. They walked deeper. Sam's breathing grew heavier, more anxious. He never runs far, the boy murmured. He just gets scared sometimes when I yell. Silas stopped. A patch of disturbed snow near a hollow log. Hair, scattered paw prints. And then a whimper, faint, fragile. Before Silas could move, Thorin shot forward faster than he'd moved in days. No hesitation, just motion. His body low, shoulders tight, eyes fixed. He pushed through the branches, and for a moment, Silas lost sight of him. Then the bark came, sharp, deliberate. Silas reached the spot a few seconds later. There, beneath a thick patch of thorns, a small brown dog crouched, trembling. Mud on its fur. One paw curled unnaturally, eyes wide with fear. And beside him, standing between the thorns and the dog, was Thorin. He didn't touch. He didn't growl. He simply stood guard. Sam dropped to his knees, crawling forward. Eli! Oh man, Eli! His voice cracked, relief and guilt tangled in the words. Thorin stepped back without being told. Silas gently lifted the injured pup, wrapping him in his coat. Sam held close to his side the entire walk back, not speaking again until they reached the edge of the woods. Back at the house, Silas called the vet. While they waited, he made hot chocolate the way Clara used to. Too much sugar, never enough milk. Sam sat on the porch steps, hands wrapped around the mug, eyes red but calmer. Thorin lay a few feet away, watching the boy. He didn't even bark at me, Sam said quietly. I thought he would. Everyone says he's dangerous. Silas looked down at the dog. Thorin's head rested on his paws, eyes half-lidded, body calm. He doesn't need to bark when he knows what to do. The boy reached out then, not much, just a hand resting near the dog's front paw. Thorin didn't move, but he didn't pull away either. When the vet pulled into the driveway, Silas rose. Sam followed. Thorin stayed back, but his eyes tracked them the entire way. As they loaded Eli into the truck, the boy turned. Mr. Monroe? Yeah? I think your dog's like a knight, he said. One of the quiet ones. The kind in books who saves people but doesn't say much. Silas didn't respond, just nodded once, long and slow. Inside later that evening, as the fire picked up and the day drained to blue, Silas sat in his chair, hand resting gently on the edge of the rug. Thorin stood near the doorway, body still. Then he stepped forward, slow, and laid down near the chair. Not at Silas's feet, not yet, but close enough that the space between them didn't feel like a wall anymore. The light that winter morning came in slow and low, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. It was the kind of morning that didn't demand attention. only patience. Outside, the sky sat gray and unmoving, and the air smelled like damp pine and earth thawing at the edges. The wind had gone quiet for once, too, and the silence felt softer than usual, like the world was waiting, not watching. Silas had woken before dawn, not from noise or obligation, but because his body knew how to greet early hours without being asked. He made coffee in the old percolator, the kind Clara never wanted to get rid of, said it made the house smell like Sundays. As it bubbled and hissed, he moved through the hallway, into the spare room, the one they used to call hers, even though it never really stopped being theirs. The room hadn't changed. Not much. A twin bed with a faded patchwork quilt, a narrow dresser with glass knobs, still holding a hairbrush and a drawer full of postcards. Above it, a shelf lined with books she never finished, but refused to donate. On the far wall, a pegboard held a winter scarf, a woolen hat, and an old leash. Below the board hung a loop of chain. It was coiled neatly, not rusted, but aged, the kind used on bigger dogs, the kind meant to hold, not guide. Silas stared at it for a long time, not in anger, just recognition. He remembered the last dog they'd tried to take in, a shepherd mix with a nervous streak. They'd found her wandering Route 12 after a thunderstorm, took her home, dried her off, tried to calm her with soft hands and softer voices. But the leash didn't help, nor the chain. She chewed through it the second night, jumped the fence and never came back. Clara had cried, but not loud, the way she cried when she thought he was asleep. Silas reached up and unhooked the chain. The links were colder than he expected, heavier too. He carried it outside without much thought, like the motion had been waiting for him to complete it. Thorin was already on the porch, stretched in his usual spot near the corner where the sun always landed first. He didn't lift his head when Silas approached, just flicked one ear in quiet acknowledgement. Silas set the chain down near the water bowl. He didn't attach it, didn't speak. He only sat on the porch step beside it, letting the weight of it rest between them. "I found something," he said after a long pause. His voice was gravel in the morning air. "Didn't know it was still in the drawer." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a letter, folded once, the paper soft from time and handling, Clara's handwriting on the front. "If you ever need it." He opened it slowly. "Silas, I know you don't want another dog. I know you think the house is too quiet to wake anything else up. But if someday something shows up at your door, a stray, a noise, a shadow, and it stays, don't send it off just because it scares you. Don't lock it out just because the silence has become a habit. Let it in. Even if it doesn't wag its tail, even if it growls, even if it's broken, especially then. You don't have to fix it. Just don't walk away. Love you always. C." Silas folded the letter back up, slow and careful, like the words might slip off the page if he moved too fast. Thorin lifted his head now. He didn't move closer, but his gaze landed on the chain. His nose twitched. He made a low sound, not quite a growl, more like a memory stirred loose. Silas reached for the chain, not to hold it, but to wrap it gently around the base of the water bowl. Not tight, just enough for the links to touch metal, enough for it to mean something. Then he stood. "No one's tying you up here," he said, mostly to the air. Not anymore. Later that afternoon, Silas cleared space in the garage. Not for tools, not for the truck, for something smaller. He laid out 2 old blankets and placed a basket nearby, lined with towels Clara had stitched by hand. He swept the corners, washed the windows, found a space heater that still worked. He didn't call it a kennel. He didn't need to. Inside the house, Thorin watched from the back door, eyes steady. When Silas opened the screen, the dog stepped out without hesitation. He walked past the chain without glancing down and followed the man through the yard, into the garage, and stood at the threshold of the space Silas had made. He didn't lie down. Not yet. But he stepped in, turned once, though, then stood still just long enough for the warmth to find him. That night, Silas left the chain out on the porch, let the frost touch it, let the wind pass through its empty loops. And when he closed the door behind him, he did so knowing that some things weren't meant to be fastened, only remembered, only released. The news traveled the way it always does in small towns, between the shelves of the hardware store, across the register at the diner, through whispers carried on the porch swing wind. A photo had made its way onto someone's Facebook page, a still from the local news. A boy, a dog, a snow-dusted forest. The caption read, "This is Thorin, a supposed beast who saved a child during last week's storm. Heroes come in unexpected shapes." It didn't go viral, but it went far enough for the wrong man to see it. The first time Silas noticed the pickup truck, it was idling near the end of his street. Mud-caked, dented tailgate, plates out of state. It didn't belong to anyone from Trinidad. He knew every truck within a 10-mile radius by sound alone. This one hummed differently, like it hadn't been cared for in a long time. Thorin stiffened when he saw it, then did something he hadn't done since the day Silas brought him home. He turned, slowly, and walked behind the porch railing, body lowered, eyes hard. Silas didn't ask. He didn't need to. The dog's body told the story. The second time the truck came, the man got out. Silas was chopping kindling near the shed when he heard the door slam. Gravel crunched beneath work boots too heavy for someone just stopping by. Thorin was already at Silas's side, standing without growl or bark. Just standing. The man was thick in the shoulders, mid-40s, wore a ball cap pulled low over eyes that didn't know how to rest. A long scar ran from his temple down to his jawline, puckered like old rope. His voice, when he spoke, was loud in the way insecure men always are. "That him?" He jerked his chin toward Thorin. "The dog from the news?" Silas didn't answer. He looked once at Thorin, whose ears had flattened. "Name's Travis," the man continued, tapping his chest. "Used to own that dog. Name wasn't Thorin back then. Called him Blade. Damn good guard dog. Mean as hell. Kept my property safe for years." Silas didn't flinch, just kept his hand loose on the handle of the axe. "Thing is," Travis went on, reaching into his jacket, "he's mine. Got paperwork right here." He pulled out a weathered folder and held it high like a badge. "AKC, shot records, date of birth. That dog's registered in my name, so I'll be taking him back now." Thorin took one step forward. Not a charge, not a lunge, just one slow, deliberate step. He positioned himself between Silas and the man, head low, tail still, chest rising in controlled breaths. His eyes locked on Travis, not in fear, not even in challenge, but with something more ancient. Recognition, memory, refusal. Silas's voice, when it came, was softer than Travis expected. "You gave him up for $50. Travis spat to the side. Didn't give him up, sold him. Thought he was useless after that last storm knocked him around. Didn't know he'd get famous. Silas said nothing. The silence between them widened until it filled the yard. From across the fence, a neighbor had stepped out. Then another. The old woman from the blue house on the corner. The teenage boy who shoveled driveways. Even old Mr. Danton, wrapped in a flannel blanket. They weren't close enough to interfere, but they stood, watched, like sentinels. Travis shifted. Look, man, I don't want to make trouble. Just give me my dog. No hard feelings. Still, Silas didn't speak. His hand never left the axe handle, though his grip never tightened. He looked down at Thorin, who had not growled, not barked, not moved again. Then he looked back up. If you really think, Silas said, voice dry as pine bark, that he'd go with you, call him. Travis opened his mouth, then stopped, because the truth was plain. Thorin had not moved, had not blinked, had not flinched. His body, though wounded, stood like stone. His silence was not hesitation. It was conviction. Travis muttered something under his breath, turned, and walked back to his truck. The engine coughed to life, then pulled away, too fast for the road, too loud for the day. The yard was quiet again. Thorin remained still. Then, slowly, he turned his head, looked up at Silas, and lowered himself to the ground, still facing the road, not in fear, in finality. Across the street, Mr. Danton raised a hand. The boy nodded. The old woman pressed her palms together briefly, as if in prayer. Silas knelt beside the dog. You told him, he said, without a word. And Thorin, for the first time since coming to this house, leaned the full weight of his body into the man's side. Spring didn't rush in through Trinidad. It arrived slowly, gently, like someone returning to an old home with a suitcase full of apologies. The last of the snow melted into the soil behind Silas's house, trickling into the roots of the stubborn little tree Clara had planted years ago. It had survived winters harsher than this one, and now somehow new buds were forming along its thin arms. Pale green, quiet proof that time hadn't stopped, just paused for breath. Silas noticed the change first in the air. It no longer bit his skin when he stepped outside in the morning. Instead, it brushed past him, carried the smell of damp earth, pine bark, and something sweeter, like the promise of something not yet bloomed. The wind still whistled through the hills, but its song had softened. Less warning, more memory. Inside, the house shifted too. Silas moved things. Not out of necessity, but because something inside him asked for space to breathe. He cleared off the second armchair near the fireplace, dusted the old seat cushion, repaired the squeaky leg Clara used to complain about but never fix. Then he placed the chair just to the right of his own. Slightly angled, facing the same view of the window, where sunlight made golden pools on the rug. He didn't call it Thorin's chair, but that's what it became. Most evenings, Silas would settle into his usual place with a book, something he'd read before, not because he forgot the ending, but because he wanted to remember how it felt to read it the first time. Thorin would lie beside the other chair for a while. Then, with a sigh that sounded too human for a dog, he'd climb up, curl tight, and rest his head on the armrest like he'd always belonged there. Silas never told him to get down. He never needed to. Outside, the town thawed. Children reappeared on sidewalks, kicking leftover slush with their boots. Shops reopened their side doors. The scent of fresh paint drifted from porches, and folks waved more often, longer than before. Like maybe they'd all remembered something during the long winter, something about being seen. At the grocery store, Silas no longer kept his eyes low. He nodded when people greeted him, said a few words. Once or twice he even smiled. It wasn't forced, it wasn't loud, but it was real. One afternoon, as he loaded canned goods into his truck, a stranger approached, mid-30s, worn leather coat, kind eyes. "You're the guy with the German Shepherd, right? From the rescue?" Silas didn't correct him. The man gestured to the passenger seat of his own car. A young boy sat there, cradling a smaller dog, all ears and nerves. "We were thinking of giving him up," the man said. "But my kid, he saw your story. Said if a dog like that one could learn to stay, maybe this one can too." Silas said nothing, but he reached into his bag and handed over a box of biscuits. "These help," he said. Then he tipped his hat and left it at that. Back home, Thorin was waiting by the porch, not pacing, not worried, just there, like always. When Silas stepped up the stairs, the dog brushed his side gently. Not a demand, just contact. That night, Silas did something unexpected. He sat by the radio, turned the dial gently through static and stations, until he found a song Clara used to hum. He didn't sing along. He didn't need to. He just sat back in his chair, eyes half closed, letting the notes wash the walls. Thorin stirred, then stepped down from his spot, walked to Silas, and laid his head across the man's knee. Silas didn't pet him. He rested his hand there. Still. Warm. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes danced. The old ones he'd hung again last week. Just like she used to. Just like before. When the song ended, Silas leaned forward slightly and whispered into the soft fur beneath his palm. "Chang ai ku ai ka. We just stayed." Thorin didn't move, but his tail, slow as the river that ran behind the town, tapped once against the floorboards. And that was enough. Sometimes kindness isn't loud. It's just someone choosing to stay. If this story touched something quiet in you, something tender, share that part. Tell us what stayed with you. Or type "Amen" if you believe broken things can still find their way home. We'd love to read your story, too. Some stories don't need grand finales. No medals, no headlines. Just two quiet souls who found each other when the world had stopped knocking. Silas never meant to save a dog. Thorin never asked to be saved. But somehow, between broken chairs and radio songs, snowy nights and shared silence, they stayed. And in that choice to stay, they built something stronger than rescue. They built belonging. Maybe that's all any of us really want. Not to be fixed, not to be perfect. Just to be seen and stayed with. If you've ever loved a dog that others gave up on, or if you were the one no one stayed for, this story was for you. Tell us in the comments, who stayed with you when no one else did? Or tell us your dog's name, the one who never let go. And if you believe that quiet kindness can still change the world, type "Amen." Thank you for listening. This story may be finished, but its echo is yours to carry.